Well, good evening. My name's Dave Revelia, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm a scaleaholic. Is that this? This is not this meeting, is it? There's not a scale. As you can see, there's not a scale I don't like. So, but there's a purpose. I've got a few things to show you here, and there's a reason that I've done several scales, because I can show you things better on some scales than I can others. And you don't have to take notes in this, because when you're all done, if you could have it, I've got about a 13-page synopsis of what we're going through. Oh, wow. This was not written by me, by the way. It was downloaded from somebody on the internet. He's given credit here, and it's just a handout. I have one for each one of you when it's over. Okay, it's sort of the guideline I'm using to teach the classwork. The reason I spent a lot of time on figures, like a lot of us, is the fact that when I done some of my work, some of my structures and buildings, the weakest part about what I had was figures. I didn't like the end result. And I know you guys know a lot about dry brushing, and I know you guys know a lot about washes, and neither one of those techniques are used in this. So just forget them for figure making, because pretty much they're not used. I can't say they're not completely used. But typically figure making or figure painting occupies three different mediums, which is acrylics, which is what we're going to go over, oils, and enamels. And really quality figure makers use all three, or figure painters use all three. But we're going to concentrate on acrylics, and I think for what we're trying to do for model railroading and the scale you guys are working in, this is pretty good stuff. By the time if you master this, I think you're going to be pleased with the figure that you have. Another disclaimer here. In the world of scale figure painters, I'm not on the radar screen.
I thought you were champagne.
Not on the radar screen, guys. I gather up information. I've gone to the internet. I've practiced a lot, but I'm sort of self-taught, using a lot of other people's data to get this done. Anyways, we're going to talk about acrylics. We're going to go through the materials first, and I'll start with some of the items required to do decent painting. And first of all are the brushes. You really have to have good quality brushes. If you don't have good quality brushes, then it will affect the outcome. And I have a resource sheet to give you a couple of locations where you can buy some decent brushes. I think the standard for the industry is the Winsor & Newton Series 7. There are other people out there that offer them, and in fact, the company that I use most of my paint with, which is Vallejo, which is a Spanish company, they offer a line of fairly nice Kolinsky sable brushes, not too expensive. It's for a set of three, different range, it's going to be about $19. But if you take care of them, they'll last you a very long time. They should last you years. One of the things you need to know about them is that, and one of the key things with brushes are they must maintain their shape. If they don't maintain their shape, then you're going to not like the results you get with the figures you paint. And one of the things about the quality brushes is they help maintain that shape. The other thing you got to do is not mix them with another medium. If you buy them for doing acrylic, don't use them with oils. Don't use them with enamels. It'll affect them, and you should have exclusive brushes for this purpose. There's a range of them. Typically, a 1, a number 2, a number 1, and a 0. I would recommend, if you're S-scaling it, that you get down to maybe the 4-0. If you're using enamels or oils, those small brushes don't hold a lot of paint. But with the technique you can learn here tonight with acrylics, it's surprising how much they do have. The other thing that you need to work with besides the brushes are some sort of palette to mix your paint in. When you work with acrylics, you almost never, and I don't do it, so that's why I'm saying almost, because there's no real solid rules in this, ever use the paint straight out of the bottle. You dilute it. This business is about shades and feathering. And by using a mixture of 1-to-1, 1 drop, or 1 part water, 1 part paint, 2 parts paint, two parts water, 1 part paint, 2 parts water, 1 part paint, 5 parts water, you're going to get the effects that you want, that you'll see here. Now, I've got these figures here that I want to show you. And by the way, these are the only S-scale figures I've ever painted. So,
Well, you should be proud of yourself.
anyways, what I want to do is sort of pass them around. You're going to see that I painted one ordinary and one I detailed. They're the same figure painted both ways. And you guys want to pass them around. You'll see the differences by using the techniques. And mind you, when you look at them, there are no oils. There's no washes and no dry brushing done in this technique. It's about shadowing and highlighting. While we're passing that around, some of the other things you're going to need is that you have to learn how to control the paint on your brush. If you take the brush, you put paint, you dilute it, you put it on, you put your brush, go straight to the figure, it's going to run. So what you have to learn to do is, this is an old t-shirt material, and you can see I've used it quite a bit. You unload the brush. You have to, all I do is, I usually get this damp, and all I do is touch the brush to it. It's like a regular routine. I go to the paint, I go to this, I go to the figure. And it's not difficult. It's just a part of a routine. And what happens when you get that diluted paint on here, you take off most of it, and believe me, there's still some left on here, then you go to the figure. Now, in some cases, if you're taking, for instance, this figure right here, he's got large surfaces. In some cases, you can go straight from the paint to the figure if you're covering a very large surface with the base coat. You deal with 3 coats here. In general, we're going to talk about 3 coats. If you start talking about the high-end figure painter guys, you get 10 coats. They do all kinds of different shading that is difficult to achieve with a figure this size. So I don't bother with it typically. I just use 3 different colors of the same coat on the figure. So this was an important piece. Got to have that. You got to have water, and you really should. If you notice the way I get the paint here, these are in eyedropper bottles. That means I can control it. I can put 1 drop in, and then I have another bottle and give me a drop. This is just water, and then I drop a water in at 1 to 2 or 1 to 3, 1 to 5, whatever the dilution is going to be. But the idea is you can control it by dropping it in.
Dave, is it distilled water, reverse osmosis?
I tell you what I do. I take drinking bottles. I just take a.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all I use. It's as pure as I think it needs to be.
Detergent or no?
There's no detergent in it. None, zero. You don't want any of that. Now, one of the really interesting features of using acrylic paint is the fact that it dries quickly. In fact, the reason you have to layer or feather acrylic paint is because it doesn't blend very well. With oils, you can blend an oil, and you can cause a shade to go from one to another by blending. With acrylics, that is almost impossible to make happen. You can do it to a limited degree, but not very much. So, but the drying time on this paint is very quick when you apply it to a figure. It'll be seconds, and you'll be able to go back and cover it again with a different color, or a different filter, or a different shade of what you're working on. Let's see. You need clean water to clean your brushes. You're always cleaning them. You're always cleaning the old paint out, putting the new paint on. So you need a bottle of water sitting there. Should be clean to start with. And that's pretty much the elements that you need to get started doing figure painting. Now you need to prep the figure. And prepping the figure, you guys all know what that's like. You come out, they have flash on them, they have parting lines on them, they have, maybe have something that's misshaped. You need to take and clean them up. And I use, files. I use probably more often a sharpened number 11 razor knife. And in some cases, if the figure's big enough and they can stand it, like this scale figure, right? These are O-scale figures. I've actually used my Dremel tool with a wire brush on it and lightly cleaned them up. Kind of speeds up the process. One of the reasons I got into doing larger scale figures, and when I mean larger scale, I sort of jumped. This is a 1/35 scale figure. The military models use it a lot. The reason I went to that figure was because the quality of the figure was much better than you could get in smaller figures. And I have to say, those are Aspen figures, and as far as quality goes, I don't think they get much better for that size. But in O scale, if you compare, I'll send a couple of these around. If you compare this figure with this figure, and I want you to look at the face on this figure, I can achieve more detail with this figure than I could that one. That's one of the reasons I started to do that. I was learning how to paint figures using this larger scale. It helped me get a long ways towards it. It also helped me find out what the shortcomings were with these smaller figures. Anyways, when you start with the figure, you got to clean the flash off. You got to prime it. Now, I use this Citadel color primer. I guess a lot of fantasy figure guys paint with this stuff. The only reason I use this is because it's smooth. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be what you need. And I use white because white takes the paint much better than, say, gray. Now, I've used primers before. Like I use automotive primers. I do some other military modeling, and I use automotive primers for some of that. But in those cases, I don't mind a rough surface. In this case, I don't want a rough surface. So whatever primer you use, it just needs to be smooth. And it really shouldn't interfere with the colors that you're trying to paint onto your figures. So far we've got the figure, we've cleaned the figure, I actually jumped ahead. I usually mount the figure. What you see these guys mounted on is a closet rod that I just cut up to small pieces. It's important that I be able to put that figure down and not have it fall over. It'll ruin whatever you're working on. So this works out for a good base, really good base for these size figures. And you can even see I've used it on this guy here. In this particular case, I put this block on the bottom so it wouldn't fall over during this demonstration. But when I'm at home painting this figure, that's what I used. So now he's mounted, he's cleaned.
Well, how do you attach them?
I drill a small hole in the bottom of each, and I use a little piece of brass rod. In the case of the S-scale figures, I only do one. And when I get to a larger figure, sometimes I mount 2 holes in the bottoms to hold it in place. I mean, I just don't want it coming loose while I'm trying to paint it. So now you've got it primed, you've got it mounted, you're ready to go with it. So what you have to do then is you have to pick colors. I typically start with faces, and sometimes I separate the faces. Now, obviously in S scale they don't send them that way, but in O scale they do separate heads from bodies, and I paint them separately. And this is an example. This is actually bigger than O scale. This is a 1/35th scale figure whose head's been painted. And that's the level of detail you can get with a very well cast head. That's a Hornet figure, by the way, if anybody knows their figures. And obviously, when they have eye detail and they have face detail, you can accent that with these colors. You get really good with it. Okay, but if you look at the quality of the figures here, for instance, this guy, he's not bad, but he's not as good as that. And that's an O-scale figure. You can't quite do as much. You can actually see the eyes on this one. And S-scale, forget the eyes. I accent it, and you know, when you're looking at it, it's usually a scale 20 feet away from it. When you're looking at it, if it looks good to you from that point, then you know you achieve what you wanted. And I can't do that. I can't do eyeballs on S-scale figures. I don't know who can, but maybe somebody can. If you looked at this figure, and I'll pass him around. By the way, I already broke his weapon on the back here, so I'm being a little careful about not bumping it worse. I got to fix it. You can see that he's got much more facial detail. And this is pure acrylics. And by the way, the helmet on this guy is incorrect camouflage. The rivet counter's got me and told me that's wrong. They didn't have it out that year. Shame on me. Back to the drum roll.
Did you use magnifying glass on those other figures?
Yeah, let me talk to you about that too. I used the Opti lens. It's a number 7 lens in there. And I could not achieve the level of detail without this. This makes this almost like brings you down to that level a little bit. And I'm forced to use it. Now, maybe somebody with much better eyesight than I did. I think I'm preaching to the choir here. But I do use this all the time. And it's comfortable. I find it to be comfortable. I can work in this for quite a while.
Have you ever attached a light to one of those?
I've never attached the light, but I do work under light. Light's important. Because what you want is you want light to sort of cast a shadow, because those shadows are the ones that outline your highlighting and your shadowing. And it's important to have good lighting to cast those on there so you know where to paint them. You can see the folds and the shades in these things. And let me sort of give you an example here. I brought this. I'm not particularly proud of this jacket, but it'll help demonstrate what I want to say here. I said this is about layering and feathering. It's also about bases, highlights, and shadows. When you look at this jacket, if you look at it, if you're standing back like what you guys are, and you look at what's going on with it, you can see that under this collar here, it gets darker. In this area, it's darker. But along this area, or a ridge here, that's lighter. If you just sort of just stand back and look at it, and that's what you're trying to achieve with these. When you guys dry brush something, that's pretty much what you're trying to do. You're trying to find an edge that catches the light. But when you dry brush in figures, especially small figures, unless that figure is absolutely perfect, it's not going to catch where you want to catch. It's going to catch the imperfections. You're not controlling it. So when you're using the highlights, it's essentially doing the same thing that dry brushing does, only you're determining where it's going, and rather than the brush figuring out what it's going to pick up to do the highlighter. So that's why I'm talking about the fact that you mix these things, and I'm going to show you three colors here. Well, in this particular case, if I was doing this jacket, I could probably achieve what I want to do with those three colors. This is dark Prussian blue, which would be my base coat here. This is the first thing I paint on this figure for his jacket, let's say, or his trousers or something. And I think I've got the S-scale figures have got that done in blue. Then what I would do is I would create the highlights with a lighter color. And then the shadows would be a mixture of the blue and the black, maybe just a touch of black to give me the dark spots. And then once again, using the diluted method, the base would go on. I'd take the base, I'd put a drop in, I'd put 1 drop of water in. I'd paint the figure's base color. It may have to be painted twice to get good coverage, but when you're done with that, you've got your base color. Then typically I go back and do the shadows, which means I would take that base color, put another drop over here, a drop of black into it, and then I would dilute that at least 2 to 1. And then I'd go back with my paintbrush, and see that line right there? I'd create a dark line in that fold, if that was on a figure. So that black-blue combination, in a more diluted fashion, would go into those locations. I'd do it under any place that you can see where the shadows are dark. And that's why when you're working under a light, those places sort of create themselves. You can see it. You can see where they create themselves in the light here. You can see it on a figure. And it's important that you try to follow those. Those are the natural folds that you get within a uniform or somebody's clothing. Then the highlights are created with a lighter blue. Now I may even want to put a little white in this, but what I can do with this is sometimes I go back at 5 to 1. I put 1 drop in and 5 drops of water, and therefore it's very subtle lighting. So then I go over this ridge here, and sometimes I'll go over larger surfaces. If it's lighter here, and the beauty of this is if you don't feel like you're comfortable with all that, there's too many sharp edges on things, then you go back to your regular base, you put maybe 3 drops of water in, and you just go back over the whole thing, and you just paint over the whole piece after that. And then it sort of draws all those colors together. Now, if you're not comfortable with the highlights then, you go back and do more highlighting. It's that thin that you're putting that paint on. It's just a back and forth situation. Now, so far I've talked about clothing, mostly. Faces are a whole different issue.
What product is your paint?
This product right now, this is Vallejo paint. And I have, like I said, it'll be in the handout that you get. I also have Andrea paint, which is, say, made in Spain for some reason. But I don't, and I haven't experimented very much with this, but I was able to find some light colors here. That's a dark red. And I make flesh using, for these kinds of figures, for this scale, S-scale figures, I make flesh using 3 different colors. It'll be on a handout. I use a sunny skin tone, is what it's called. I use a dark red, and I use a bit of what is called English uniform to give it color. And with those three faces, I can paint the majority of faces on these figures, except the large one you see going around. That has a little bit different stuff going on it, but it's much more detailed. That's enough to get you by. And I would recommend, these are you can get these for about $2.50 a piece. Because they're eyedropper in nature, they'll last you a long time, a very long time. They don't go bad on you. But it's also important to remember, with paints, any of these acrylic paints, shake the heck out of them before you use them. Because they do separate. And if you get that separation, you will not get the intensity of the color that you want. So you've got to shake them. In fact, when I shake them, I actually pound them against my hand. Make sure I got them mixed up really good. And I'll do it for a few seconds before I use it. And then you go through and you do the
You
dilution
put a
process.
little
You get
screw
the
or
best
ball
coverage.
bearing in your acrylics?
Pardon? No, I do not. No.
You
You
can't.
can't,
because
I don't think you can even get it in,
it's
I don't think you can even get it in there. I mean, I'll pass these around, you guys can look at them.
Okay, those are smaller than the one
Yeah,
out in mine.
Yeah.
I tried putting the ball bearings in the poly scale and whatnot, not realizing they were made out of steel and they all rusted and
Yeah.
I lost the paint. So unless you can find a stainless steel one.
I wouldn't even recommend it, I just don't do it. And I just shake them the way I did, I showed you there, and I have no difficulties with them. So, I mean, those are the basics under which the painting is. Now, when you get this brochure from me, there's actually sort of lessons here. You can actually go through some processes. It talks about the shadowing, the layering, the feathering, and there's some exercise practices you all can do with this based on this information in here. I don't expect to be able to cover all of that in the short amount of time that we have. And trying to paint detail on somebody's face. To the class this size with a figure that big, you all have to be up around here like this. It isn't going to happen.
What's the smallest scale you use this technique on?
I use them as low as HO scale. The difference is the amount of which you can accent. Now, obviously, the accent and facial features on an HO scale figure are not as great, but you don't have to be as precise. What would be the eye sockets, for instance, and you create a dark shadow with the eye sockets, they will represent eyes, and as it sits on your layout or it sits on your diorama, you can't tell the difference. But it also, you highlight the folds. Some things get a little more profound and accent, a little less blended, a little less subtle, because you need it to stand out a little bit more further out because it's such a smaller item. On a larger scale figure, if you don't blend, you don't cover them correctly, then what happens is you get these sharp divided lines between them, and you want to avoid that. And that's why you talk about this layering and feathering is a constant back and forth situation. For a figure painter, it's constant. It's just, you're just trying to get to that right, the right accent on the fold and the dark side until you achieve that. And because these paints are so thin, when you're doing it, you can do that without building up a lot of paint on a figure. Now, all of these, like I said, were done with the exact same technique. Some of them were done with scale figures. Some of them have a fair amount of detail on them, like this gentleman. And some of them don't. I believe that's a purse figure, and it does not have a lot of folds. It does not have a lot of places in which light can react. Under your pockets. I mean, if you all look at each other's shirts right now, you can see where, that there would be a darker area, a lighter area, and that's all you're trying to achieve, and this is a controlled effect. If when you're painting, you find that your brush is sort of not staying together, you probably have too much paint on it. Go back to your rag and unload it a little bit, and then go back to your figure. Now, one other thing that you can do here, this whole color business is scary to most guys. And I got to tell you right now, I cheat. I take from other people's work, I've studied other people's work, I read their articles, I figured it all out, I cheat. One of the things I've discovered is that the roadblock to doing this is you cannot, what colors? What colors go with what colors? And, you know, artists have a real eye for this kind of stuff, and some people don't have the eye, they need a lot of help. Well, if you go to your local building store, Home Depot or Lowe's, you can go to their paint section, and they're going to give you a lot of help. Because right now, you can see the color scale here. And all of those colors accent themselves. Which means that you can actually go to Walmart, pick up their paint, or go to Lowe's, pick up a couple of cards, go to Walmart, pick up a couple of paints, and sort of match them up against that. You can use this as a color palette. And I picked up a couple of them here, and you can see the range. So this would be the light, this would be your dark. And you can use those as sort of a base. And in between, you can use this as the base color, find something that matches. You can use a little bit of this or a little bit of this to create this with this. It's a blending effect. But if you need a little help, that's where I've discovered it. And they used to come out with those books on paint chips. It would be a great reference. The other place that I go is the internet. I also get a number of magazine subscriptions, but I go to the internet, and then after I go to the internet, I download formulas. Now I have a complete set of Vallejo paints. The complete set's 220. I don't expect everybody to go that route, but I do a lot more figure painting, and I'm trying to get better at it in other scales besides what I'm doing with model railroading. So, but what I have done is I've gone to, and I've given you some websites to go to, and it'll be on the sheet that I hand you. I've gone there, and I've basically copied what they said, and they have color blends that you can use to create. And they talk about the mixtures and the bases and how you go about that. So this is where I find a lot of what I use. The other place, like I said, I go to are magazines.
Figure painting sites?
Pardon?
Are these figure painting sites?
Yes, I've given you a couple of figure painting sites that will help out. Now, you know, you can take this to any degree you want, but they do give you little hints and clues, and they help you with color combinations. The other thing I've done is I get magazines, and Figure International is one, for instance, and they paint figures all the time, and they give you the formulas for how they did it. And they give you the shades that match. And I use these as basis for everything I do. Now, the really nice part about painting civilian figures is if you don't want, you know, his pink pants goes with his green shirt, somebody out there in the world's walking around like that. When you're do the military stuff, there's somebody out there going, no, they never did that. But in the railroad stuff, it's much easier to paint a civilian figure than it is to paint one of these guys, because somebody will come along and go, you know, wrong uniform, wrong color, wrong texture, whatever. But in civilians, it's much easier. So, I mean, they blend the colors, they go across the color spectrums with this stuff. You can find this stuff on the internet. I've also found just straight formulas on the internet. User groups. And they tell you the colors. They've also, if you go on the internet, you'll find assistance in painting faces. They go through the whole process, from beginning to end. From the base color, faces are difficult. They're probably the most challenging piece of what you're going to do. And of the face, the eyes are the worst. But if your scale's small enough, forget the eyes. And then it just goes through that whole process. You take little bits and pieces. Maybe you only want to use 2 steps of the shade. It's good enough for the scale you're working with. So there's a wealth of information out there. And like I said, the handout I'm going to give you at the end of this, anybody who wants it.
Ever try just going to your computer, to the color scheme on the computer and looking at the different...
It's a good idea. I never thought of it, but it's a good idea. It's a good idea. If
I
you're
use
trying
that
to
when
get...
I'm doing buildings.
Yeah, you know, it's a great idea. Now, the other challenge that you have is that now you have to go find a paint that matches what you're trying to do.
Color wheel.
Yeah, color wheel. Like I said, there's a lot better painters out there than I am.
I'm not good. I mean, that's just some tricks I'm trying to use.
Right. So, you know, I've gone to, for instance, I tried to match up. I passed them out a few minutes ago, but those paints that I had out there were the ones I colored flesh with. And I tried to go to Walmart and match them. I could get 2 of them, the English uniform, which is sort of that green one, I couldn't find. So my recommendation is if you're going to spend some money, $2.50 on a bottle, if I buy those 3 bottles, get your faces covered, don't worry about it. There are a lot more ways to paint faces than what I'm showing you, but you know, what degree, what level do you want to get at? I can tell you right now, figure painting is a hobby itself, and you can get sucked totally into figure painting and never touch another thing.
How long does it
take you to paint like an S scale?
That figure, I painted all 6 of those S scale eight of those S scale figures in probably 2 hours time. And part of it was, I wouldn't do it normally. What I did is because I'm trying to match figures here, I painted the base on one, then base on the other one, and then I had to go back while it was still fresh in my palette to use the paint and go ahead and do the shading on the figure that I wanted to do more detail on. It's not typical. I just did that for this kind of class. So, I would say that 30 minutes on a figure, you're going to feel like you invested some time. I do believe it's possible. It's also good to be prepared when you're doing your figures. Sort of figure it out what you're going to do. Get your figures all primed, get the number of them done, try to get as many things done. I collectively painted all the faces at one time. And got that piece done. And then I went to the other pieces, and if you're going to paint one-offs and you're going to keep mixing paint for every time you try to do one, it's going to take you longer to do so.
That's your manufacturing background.
Is that it?
Yeah.
It also drives you nuts when you're painting figures. Now, the other thing about this palette that I use, you can see I didn't clean this one out completely. This paint's beautiful for this. I paid 99 cents at Michael's for this thing. I got several of them. When I'm all done, I let it dry. I just peel it out. I use it again. Sometimes I take hot water to it, scrub it off. Try to get the debris off of it, but it's reusable. The paint's great for that. Paint cleans up beautifully. That's the nice thing about acrylics. The other thing good about acrylics are, as opposed to oils, is they don't darken over time. Oils will get darker. And you've got to account for that because your figure can look a lot different a year or 2 years from now than it does. But acrylics don't have that issue. They're bright and they dry flat. That's another key thing. They dry flat. So if you want something to shine like a leather belt, you're going to have to come up with some other methods to do that. Now there are other little finishes that come for that purposes. But I found for the scale we're working in, for the degree we're going for, I haven't had to go that route. And none of those figures that you see, including the large one, has any of that done to it.
So once you're finished, you're not sealing them with the back?
I do seal them. I seal them with dull coat.
Okay, don't touch that.
Only because I just don't want it. I mean, this paint will wear off
Yeah.
fairly easy. So, and I imagine that I'm handing some of these around. By the time I get them back, I'll probably have to. But I don't think I dull coated any of these. I'll probably have to touch them up if I want to do something with them. Let me see here. I want to make sure that I cover this issue of shadows and highlights. The base, the shadow, the highlights, the feathering, and the layering. The feathering being that, if you can take and go over an area that you just painted, say for instance dark, and you can layer on a lighter color, or you can start with a very dark color in here and then layer out or feather out highlighting colors. But once again, in HO S scale, it's harder, and because the figures have less detail to them, you find yourself doing less of that, and you still have a pretty quality figure.
Can you show us something about how you actually hold the figure in position and hold your brush?
Boy.
Because especially when you get down to fine detail.
How hard do you bite on your tongue?
Yeah. How many fingers do you cross?
I use this is a zero brush. I use this probably more than any other brush for these smaller scales. It's pretty simple. I put my dork helmet on. And all I do is try to hold it and have lighting that's somewhere, try to keep it above me a little bit, and I'm just this close to the figure, looking at it. I'm using a number 7 lens, and with a number 7 lens, if you don't get this close, you don't see the figure. I mean, it's out here, this far it's blurred. This close, I can work with it. But when I work with it this close, I mean, this is pretty much how I can steady my hand against this if I need to, but I tell you, there's not a lot of steadying needed. One of the parts I haven't talked to you about yet is highlighting, or not highlighting, but lining a figure, which in many cases with small scales, because you have such a little thing to look at such a distance, you need to do it to make it happen. If you'll notice, and I'm not sure if I can point it out to you on this figure, but on this figure, you'll look at his suspenders. If you look at his suspenders on the edges next to the shirt, I've actually just drawn a line with paint. Dark. And I've done that with a very, very fine brush, with very, very thin paint. But it's a very, very dark paint. And that causes those suspenders to jump out at you. It also would be used in seams on shirts, for instance.
This
Or
is the darker
cuffing
color
pants.
of the same, of the base color of that.
It can be darker, the base color, and some kinds, and sometimes in particular green, black, or black-gray complements it. So you can work it with that.
You're not weathering, you're actually painting.
That's right, but when you put this, I'm telling you, when you put this on and you're using a brush,
It's got 3 hairs on it.
this brush, which you can almost can't even see them. But because you're using acrylics that are diluted, it actually holds quite a bit of paint. You can do a lot of damage with that thing.
That's a 0? No?
This is a 4-0, 4-aught brush. And I use that for a lot of highlighting around insignia, if it's on a shirt in that particular case, suspenders, and it causes those to jump out.
So you
Yeah.
don't ever use the black wash type effect like we use on rocks?
No, I do not. No, not, I do not. It's this is about control. What happens with dry brushing and washes is you lose control.
Yeah.
It goes wherever it goes and you get whatever effect it's going to give you. This is about controlling the effect. You can actually have a bad figure, a figure that doesn't got very much detail or very good detail, and because you're controlling the painting, you can put the detail where you wanted it, where it should have been and it isn't on the figure. You can actually control it that much. That's why I'm saying that it's very important to unload that brush all the time, because you're controlling where that's going. And, you know, you run into a crease, you know, if I'm painting on this jacket, if this jacket's small, let's say, but if I'm going down this, and this is a highlighted area, it pops out as a light area to you. I simply go down with the diluted mixture, down that one time. And because I'm using a light shade of color, a little bit lighter than the base, it will cause that to stand out a little bit more. If it's too much, then I can go back over it with the base, do it over again. But in this particular case, now this has a lot of orange thread on it, in this size that we're doing, you're never going to see it.
Play with that.
But, you know, in this particular case, I would most likely take a very dark blue, almost blue-black, and run it across the seam, very thinly, and it would cause that to stand out as a seam, and that's what I did in some of those cases you saw in there.
Going back to his question, when you use the brush, are you using the very tip of the brush, you use a little bit on the side?
I use a little bit on the side depending on what I'm doing. I use the tip. If I'm actually lining something like this, I'm using the tip. Great control. But if I'm going down and trying to create a highlighted area on a broader seam, then sometimes I use the side of the brush. You just got to really get a touch for it. And of course, the different size brushes mean you cover different size areas. If I have a larger fold, I'm going to use a larger brush. Smaller fold, smaller brush. But I tell you, when I painted those S-scale figures, I used this brush a lot. Because trying to highlight a pocket with a brush, and this is I believe this is the number 2, but this is the number 1. You can see the brush difference here. It's huge. And this is much more difficult to use on that small figure than this one is. So I use this quite a bit on that figure. And then constant cleaning.
As you're putting your paints on and you're doing your layers, are you letting them dry between layers?
They dry, yes, I do let them dry, but this acrylic dries so quick. Now, there are cases when you don't want it to dry so quick. And there is a way of extending the life so that you can get a little bit of blending if it's required. This is a Winston & Newton, what's called blending medium. It's called blending medium for watercolor, but it works for acrylics. If you add a drop of this, and this is what I have in this, to your paint, it'll extend the life of that paint. It won't dry. I use almost none of this. I expect that this bottle's going to last me the rest of my life. Because I don't like working with paints. And I tell you, when the figures get larger, for instance, on the large figure that I have going around, when I painted his eyes, I needed a little more working time. I'm working with a small brush, the very smallest brush, which I keep seeming to lose it. I don't even know what I do with it.
Basically the 4-aught.
Yeah.
Yes, I use the 4-aught. I use the 4-aught on his eyes, but that brush holds almost no paint. So when I went to try to do his eyes and work with it, it dried on me. And it dries that quick. So what I did is I put just a little bit of dab of this blending medium in the middle of the palette, put my brush in a little bit, then I went to the paint, put it on. It gave me a little more working time. But I didn't have to do it for the scale figures that we have to do the small ones. It just didn't, it wasn't required. It's typically something that's done when you're trying to do much finer detail.
So you typically, in your value, that's what we're really talking about, is you got a blue color and you got various values of that blue. So you
Absolutely.
do the base color, then you do the darker value, then you do the lighter value.
And that's a matter of taste. Some people do the lighter, then they do the darker. And I typically do the base, I do the darker, then I do the lighter. But there are, once again, as you step into different areas, the large figure you see had like 5 different blends of that same paint, so that I would get a natural effect in the folds and of the uniforms and of the shirts and the pants. The other thing that you can do, because this color is transparent, and I want to highlight this guy. If you'll notice his boots, if you notice the boots on this gentleman here, they look fairly worn. Well, the base boot was painted with it was leather brown, dark brown. Then I went back with almost an orange color, very thin, and went over the leather brown. And what happens is it gives you that highlighting effect, you see. It also gives you that worn appearance of the boots. That's the transparent nature of this. That's the beauty of this paint, is because you can take, and the large German that I've got walking, if you look at his boots, they look a little bit worn. That's not by accident. That's because I took almost a bright orange paint, diluted 5 to 1. Sometimes I do 15 to 1. It's almost no paint in this. And I go over and over until you get the achieved effect that you want. But in the particular case of the Eskio guys, all I did was take the dark, then I took some of the, if you looked at the boots on each one of these guys, one's just brown, one of them looks like a little bit more like leather. All I did was take the dark brown, diluted the heck out of the orange brown, and went back over the top of it. It gave me that one sort of leather look. And like I said, that is the beauty of acrylics.
On the big German, did you do the hobnails individually?
The what now?
The hobnails on the bottom of his boot individually? That was incredible.
I tried not to even pay attention to the bottom of his boots because of the fact that I was going to put them in the ground when I was done with it. But
Yeah, but you couldn't resist.
yeah, you get a little carried away with this stuff. Trying to remember what else we need to go over here. I sometimes
Like the thing where you say, if you can see underneath that piece of grass.
right. Yeah, you know how carried away. I detail the inside of buildings you never see, like somebody else I know. So, the other thing I do is sometimes in a uniform situation or a workman situation, I will take the pigment powders or weathering chalks, and I have an old brush for this because weathering chalks will destroy the brush. And I'll go over like a knee or an elbow or something with a weathering chalk, a raw umber, a dirt color, and I'll brush that on there, and it sort of helps it look like, you know, he's actually done some work that day and he's dirty. And you do that lightly, and then when you dull coat it, it's all sealed in. I'm sure we're doing
You
this.
spray the dull coat or you can?
I spray dull coat out of a can. I've got a huge spray unit that I don't use for figures at all. It's just inconvenient to have to clean it up. That's why I use a spray can. I mean, I do have, you know, I've got an Iwata spray system that's probably got $500 in it. But when I'm doing with a figure, and it's, you know, this is just easy. I walk out to the garage, I hold one of these things, I put a glove on my hands, a disposable glove on my hands, and I spray paint it. Now, also, when you spray paint these initially, look at them again. When you put the primer on them, because the primer makes all kinds of mistakes stand out. They make all the parting lines and all that stuff. You sometimes have to go back over them again and then reprime. couple of light coats of primer. Be careful with the primer. You can ruin detail on a very small figure. There's not a lot of detail there in the first place. You're going to cover it up. And you need that detail because that's what you're using to put your shadows in and your highlights in.
Building up additional detail on it using something other than just paint. Do you get into that very much, or you just pretty much use the figures stock the way they come?
On small figures, it's difficult. But I have put line, for instance, the seam line on the side of a trouser. I have added that with a very thin number 4 paintbrush, which I can't believe I lost. Oh, here it is. I have done that. And once again, it's a darker shade, maybe a dark blue in this particular case, or blue black in this particular case. The only time that I've ever really put paint on, or I'll do a paint straight, is if there's a brass or a copper button here and I've got that color. Sometimes I'll take that straight, take a little dab of it. Sometimes I use the blending with that, just to get it wet, because it goes on and covers so well for that purpose. You know, I don't want to put like 3 thin coats of brass on to depict something that's shiny.
When you use the blender, is that straight or is that diluted?
It's straight, but like I said, I mean, I'll be glad to share this bottle with the rest of you guys, because I know I'm never going to use the rest of it. It's very careful, because the beauty of acrylics is you cannot believe how quickly this stuff dries. You can go to, you know, I can paint the face, I can paint the body, I go to the next figure, I paint the face, I paint the body, I go back to the figure before it's completely dry. Then I just move on. And literally within 30 seconds, the figure's usually dry. Any more questions about figure painting? Now, this is a very high-level view, guys, but there's no way in the world in which I can sit down, unless it's to give each of you individually and say, here's the technique. But like I said, in the handout that I got for you, for those who want it, there's a number of things, a number of exercises you can use, and the principle about feathering and blending, or feathering and layering, highlighting and shadowing is all covered in here. Plus, all the materials that we talked about here, and this was a nice job some gentleman did for basic acrylic figure painting.
You see there where the stuff, supplies are available? Where do you get them?
I do. I have sort of a resource sheet for you. I've given you some numbers. Some of these things, this, I didn't come up with any. If you do an internet search, you'll probably find a million people sell it.
With this liquid paint, what do you use to clean your brushes with?
Okay, brush cleaning, very important. I have a brush cleaning solution. Now, there's a couple of things that they always recommend I don't do. First of all, they say, always take your metal figures or your resin figures and wash them. I never do it. Sorry, somebody beat me, but I never do it. And I've never had the paint come off of them. I just prime them is pretty much what I do, and I just don't see the paint flaking away. The other thing that I buy this bottle of brush cleaner, and it's like soap. And it says to dilute it. I don't dilute it. I put the brush straight into it. And then I take the brush when I'm all done with my painting session, and I just run my fingers over it, and it pulls all the paint out of it. And I do a lot of rinsing, and then I put it away. Oftentimes, though, before I put it away, and you guys who have a hotel room there, get those little bottles of conditioner, I used to throw them away, and I don't throw them away anymore. Because now I take my brush and dip them in the conditioner. And then I just let it dry. And when that stuff dries, later on when you go to use it, when it's totally dry, it just flakes off. But it helps keep the shape. That's the importance of a good brush. That shape is vital for you to have control to be able to put that paint exactly where you want it. If you don't have a good brush and your brush is all splayed out, you're not going to get the control you need.
You put a sleeve on the tip?
Pardon?
You put a sleeve over the tip?
I did in this
When you
particular
store-
case, but no. No, I'm pretty sloppy. My workbench would scare you guys. There's about 200 paints, and I look like Jeffrey Dahmer because there's about 400 little heads all over it. I just lay them flat like this. That's all I do. I make sure they're not leaning up against anything. I do not leave them in the water, but I do lay them flat, just like that. And I didn't point this out to you before, but it's good to have a nice flat brush, especially if you're doing a larger surface. If I'm doing a larger surface like this guy, sometimes I go with a larger brush. Just makes the work a lot faster.
Gets the base coat on quick.
It's based on quick.
I got a friend of mine, who's a novice painter and stuff, he said the best thing for your brushes after you clean them is saliva, and holds the shape the best.
He used to tell me about that in my boots in the Marines too. That's really shiny boots. My drill instructor told me all kinds of things on it. Sooner or later I learned better. I think that I've covered pretty much the high-level view of figure painting, guys, and I'm open to any questions that you have. It's like anything else, practice, 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 and some of us don't want to commit the time to it. So it's easier to go out there and buy some of these figures and paint them.
Some of us don't have time either.
I can tell you right now, a quality figure painter will get $2 a millimeter for his work. So now I'm talking, this guy right here is technically, he's 52 millimeters. $2 a millimeter. The really quality figure guys can draw that kind of money.
What do you put the
Wow.
primer coat on?
All I do, for the primer coat, is spray.
You just spray.
Spray it on. Now you can do it with an airbrush. The important thing about the primer is it needs to be smooth. Because if it's not smooth, that texture will affect the end result, especially on a small figure. It's even worse on a small figure than it is on a big figure. But it should be smooth. And I just use this because it's white. I can find it at my local hobby store, but certainly other things would work. That's all it is. No, this is not, I don't believe this is acrylic. This might be, in fact, I've never even looked. This could be a, this most likely is a lacquer-based or yeah.
Dave
And
Flocal makes one that they sell in the fantasy figure section.
It's fine, it'll work.
Yeah.
It'll work. It just needs to be smooth.
Yeah.
And like I said, I like working with white because of these transparent colors. It helps me get to the achieved color much quicker than I have to try to overpower some gray or some green or whatever.
You say you're painting the head separately? You're taking the heads off of the?
No.
They come that way.
Many O-scale figures, which I work in a lot, they come separate. If the figure's head is attached there, I don't take it off. I work with it as it
I was
is.
wondering how you.
But I still try to paint the faces and the hands first.
Okay.
Okay.
Why paint the faces and the hands first? I mean, is
Only because they're like small, very small details. I want to get them out of the way, and then I can try to get the, sometimes I have to go back because I missed, I painted over his hand again. But that's just my choice. You could leave it to the end if you feel comfortable with that. It's just a matter of choice.
The most logical reason for that is your clothing overlaps the skin, so
Often.
your paint overlaps.
Right, so you're trying to get it inside of the collar, you try to go back again with, it's just the way I would do it, so. Go ahead.
Dave, I've seen some of these things about the people that paint the figures black first and then work from that. Can you comment on that?
Well, what that black does is, remember I talked about the fact that there's this lining business that I talk about? Where you try to draw a line? They're creating the line before you paint the figure.
I see.
That's all. But once again, it's usually, if it's black and your figure is pink,
Yeah.
or some other color, red or some other color, it may not go with what you're trying to do. It's just almost what would be, I would call it down and dirty way. And it works pretty good in smaller scales. I've tried it myself. I've got a couple of figures. In fact, if you go out to that, I've got a diorama, Chester Rawlings. On top I have a pigeon coop. There's a figure, a fat little lady figure on there that was painted exactly using that technique. She didn't come out bad, but she didn't come out exactly the way I wanted to.
Well, how many coats of the lighter paint do you have to put over?
I've never tried it that way. I used to use that, my figures out there all suck. So I've transitioned from that to something. I've never tried to use the black since I picked up this method. I've never gone back to anything else.
It's a lot harder to paint that on black. You can't see the detail.
Right.
It takes 3 or 4 coats to get lighter color.
I'm not a master at painting figures. I've tried all these techniques, like Brian Field uses that, starting with black. The overall tone of the figure is just much darker and doesn't have any pop to it.
Right.
I've switched to the white. I'm making very thin layers and building it up. It just looks so much better in model form because unfortunately we're not outside with our lighting, we're inside, So our models are dark to start with, and they just look so much better. than
It
they
makes a
look like
huge
this.
difference. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen figure painters who do pretty good work on the body of the figure, and I look at their faces and they're so dark. I mean, it's difficult to achieve that. You almost have to especially with the small scale with these guys. If you really looked at these guys underneath, I mean, they're ugly. It's an ugly paint job if you look under these. And, you know, I'm here looking at this guy, and you see what was supposed to be his cheek, and from this distance, you say, you know, it's pretty decent, but up here, it looks like crap.
Big hollows.
But, you know, this is all optical illusion. This is all illusion anyways. It's all illusion. And that's, you know, we're just trying to replicate what we see, just like everything else. I'm just saying, in figures, if you really want to get to the level that you feel this kind of a brightness to, forget the dry brushing, forget the washes, switch to acrylics. We want to use a base, a dark, and a highlight. That's pretty much it.
I had an older fellow tell me, and he painted a fair amount of figures, he said that the order in which you painted, you do your flesh, your face, your arms, your hands first, and then you paint the figure in the order in which you normally dress yourself.
Well, I'll tell you why that works. Because what happens is when you're trying to go you dress yourself from the inside out. So if I've got two shirts on, or I've got this jacket on, if I paint the inside first, then I don't have to go back around something to get to it again. Right. I don't have to get around something to get to it again. So it makes a lot of sense. And it's almost a natural tendency to have to do it that way, if you think about it. But like I said, as far as figure painters go, I'm nowhere on the radar screen, guys. So the real quality ones do things a lot different. Like I said, they work in all three mediums.
Hey, let me ask you a question. I mean, do you have any secret for using an optimizer and then painting and then getting the brush back in the paint, other than flipping it down?
Yeah, I work sort of under the radar with it. It could be down on my face, and I can see here. So the figure's up here, and I can see down here. You know, it's sort of like, it's almost like looking through bifocals. I sort of work around it. And sometimes I just flip the damn thing up and go for it. But
Just, just to go back after the lighting, do you prefer any specific type of lighting along with your glass?
I like the light to some come down. It can be incandescent light, it can be fluorescent light, but it's going to have to cast a shadow. Those shadows help. They really make a big difference. That tells you where the paint needs to go. I mean, I can tell you, since I started doing this painting figure stuff, I look at you guys' faces out here, and I can figure out where the lines are and the highlights are. Everything becomes like, how do I paint that? And like I said, you know, I think I have 7 formulas for flesh in here because not everybody's got the same color. But for the level we're trying to do, I gave you a down and dirty. Here's a flesh that works most of the time. Go for it. This scale works great.
I know what you say because I did ceramic tiles for a long time when I was in porcelain. And trying to do Oriental flesh is almost impossible.
Well, I know guys who can paint. Those guys who paint the exact figures, they're scary.
Oh, yeah.
Those figures,
Oh, yeah.
some of them, you want to ask out for a date. They look that good. I think that's pretty much it, guys. I probably have to clear the room out. I'm not sure. I think I've got till 9:15, I guess.
It's 9:15.